change in an opinion about something wouldn't itself constitute a change in the offer. And so I would have to look at the particulars, I'd have to make an honest assessment of the circumstances and perhaps of the competing claims made as to the veracity of one proposition or argument or another. But fundamentally, for something to be different, it has to be, by definition, fundamentally different. Not different in terms of wording, but difference in terms of substance. And this is in the context of a negotiation with others outside the United Kingdom. So that would be my initial feeling. Yes, indeed. Of course. I will come to the Honourable Gentleman. Point of order, Neil O'Brien.
Mr. Speaker, and I don't envy you in trying to make these difficult decisions. First, I wondered if I could press you on your understanding of substantively different. For example, were the government to come back with a proposition that they would write into law the Stormont lock, would that be substantively different? If there were to be commentary that changed our opinion of this at the European Council, would that be substantially different? I know that many members of this House already feel that having taken no deal off the table, something I voted against, already makes the situation substantially different, Mr. Speaker. So I wondered if you could say a little bit more about that. And secondly, Mr. Speaker, you listed some precedents, starting with 1604, which is very interesting to new members. Some members were here already. I was not as a new member. Of course, we are in an unprecedented situation, Mr. Speaker, in which we have voted for a referendum, given sovereignty to those who belong to the people, and we are now bound by that decision. And I would simply say to you, Mr. Speaker, how will you deal with this unprecedented situation? Because my constituents who are worried about their jobs or worried about losing the Brexit they voted for will always prefer you, instead of rigidly sticking with precedents from 1604, to be a modern speaker for modern times who can not stand in the way of delivering the deal, the only deal I believe will solve this problem.
Demonstrated with the very greatest of respect to the Honourable Gentleman over a period of 9.5 years and more, that I am not a stickler for tradition. I do not believe in doing everything the same way forevermore, just because, as so many people have said to me, "Oh, Mr. Speaker, it's always been done that way," or "Oh, we've never previously had X." I've been ready to countenance change. I remember once being told many years ago by a retired and senior clerk of this House that she was very pleased that I had secured support for the establishment of a nursery in the House, which members and staff could pay for. She just wanted to say to me she didn't know whether I was aware that throughout her 4-decade service in the House, the idea of such an established facility had periodically been discussed, but unfortunately nothing had ever happened. And that was not helpful for her in terms of work-life balance, her professional commitments and her childcare responsibilities. So I think I can say with the very greatest of respect that I have attempted to be a progressive change maker. So far as the particulars are concerned, it depends on the circumstances. It has to depend on the circumstances. I would have to look at the specifics. It would be reckless and foolhardy to pronounce in abstract. What I further would say to the Honourable Gentleman, just to remind him of the context of my statement, is that as far as the use of time is concerned, we have been addressing this matter for a period spanning 4 months. Insofar as time has been lost during that period, for example, at one point, a loss of 5 weeks, 5 weeks without the matter coming to the House, that wasn't as a result of fiat by the chair or folly by the House. It was the express decision of the government. I cannot off the top of my head remember for certain whether the Honourable Gentleman supported the government's position on that matter. I have a very high regard for his ability because he's an extremely able man. I hope he won't take offence if I say, in the nicest possible way, that he has always seemed to me to be a keen supporter of close regulatory alignment with the Government Whip's office. Yes, indeed. Mr. Barry Shearman.
Mr. Speaker, can I thank you for... Mr. Speaker, can I thank you for your guidance today? Here we are in the greatest constitutional situation and very grave situation that I've seen in my nearly 40 years in this House. And if it wasn't for your good guidance today and over the last few weeks, I think this House would have been very badly served indeed. But the fact of the matter, Mr. Speaker, is what you have said today has grave repercussions for the business of the House. And what is the advice from the Chair, or could we have an early statement from the Prime Minister or the Leader of the House? What is the next step? We're leaving the European Union. We have a few days. What is the best way that we can represent our constituents at this grave time of crisis?
The short answer is let's debate these matters sooner rather than later. Of course, the government, for the most part, controls the order paper. We know that, and the Right Honourable Lady, the Leader of the House, is the government's representative in the House. But there are, of course, situations in which members can give voice to their views, whether the government particularly wants that to happen or not. For example, on over, I think, 570 occasions over the last 9.5 years, I have seen fit to grant urgent questions, believing that that is in the interests of the House, beneficial to backbenchers and securing ministerial presence in the chamber so that the government can be legitimately questioned, probed, scrutinised, challenged and held to account. There will be further such opportunities today, and knowing the ingenuity of the honourable gentleman, who will have served 40 years in the House in less than 2 months' time, I feel certain that he will be well up to the task of posing suitable inquiries and expressing his views on this matter in the days ahead. A point of order, Mr. Peter Bone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And of course, you're absolutely correct at what Urging May says. A motion or an amendment which is the same in substance as a question which has been decided during a session may not be brought forward again during the same session. I think that is absolutely clear. And I was, sir, wondering when you allowed the second meaningful vote. I obviously you're ruling on it, but it was clearly a balanced decision on that occasion. But what this seems to be clear to me, sir, it is about the motion, whether it's substantially changed or not. It's not about whether something else has happened. That's irrelevant. It's what has actually happened to the motion. And of course, we do have the procedure in this House, Mr. Speaker, of the previous question. And I was possibly thinking of doing that. The reason we have the previous question is so that the same question can continue to be debated another time. So would you confirm that, sir, that it's about the substance of the motion, not something else happening outside?
It is about the substance of the motion, what it is commending to the House, what proposition is being put. It is not a question purely of the words, but of the meaning, of the intention, of the purpose. Yes, indeed. Point of order, Mr. Tom Bray. I do beg the Right Honourable Gentleman's pardon. If I may, I'll just come to Mr. Pete Wishart first, and then I'll come to the Right Honourable Gentleman. Mr. Pete Wishart.
Very grateful to you, Mr. Speaker, and I think what you've made today is a very important and dramatic statement. And already constituents of mine are getting in touch with me asking exactly what that means. And I think we've got to be actually clear with the country with what you've said. The government cannot bring back another meaningful vote if it's the same substance as the last one. Now, the government's one and only intention is to achieve and secure that. This week, they were intending to do that very, very thing, and now you said that can't happen. So I think just to stress that clarity, Mr. Speaker, I think would be abundantly helpful. But my experience of this government, and I don't know if it's yours, is they will try anything to get this through. And they will have the impertinence to try and bring this back once again through any sort of guise that they think is going to be possible. And maybe it'll be the DUP agreeing with their deal. Could you say to us, Mr. Speaker, how you intend to be vigilant to that prospect and what criteria will be assessed if the government is going to bring back some sort of motion which they will try to present as being significantly different to their last motion? How do we judge and assess what they are doing so that this ruling can stand? Because it is an important ruling and it's a correct ruling.
It seems to me that it's principally a question of whether the proposition is the same or substantially the same. I would confer, I would of course seek advice, I would have my eyes and ears open, and I am looking to serve the House, to reflect its interests, and to demonstrate respect for its wishes. I simply repeat that the Convention is there for a purpose, and that purpose seems to me to be an honourable and valid purpose. I'm afraid as to the particulars, I will have to look at them in the light of what is presented, but I would hope that the government would feel that respect for procedure does matter. And, you know, I note that as the Right Honourable Gentleman asks his question and I respond, the Leader of the House is playing with her electronic device, and so is the Deputy Chief Whip. I didn't include him in the category of very senior people in the House, but that's a debatable proposition, I readily grant. But it would seem to me to be helpful if people showed respect for each other in these circumstances, and if they were in the chamber, listened to what others had to say. But if they choose not to do so, well, so be it. I try to show good manners, and I hope others will try to do so as well. And a point of order, Mr. Robert Halfon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I understand your clarity on this. Just to confirm, given that the vote for a second referendum was overwhelmingly rejected by the House of Commons last week, does this mean that if it is brought back, you apply the same considerations so that the motion won't be repeated?
Earlier inquisitors that everything depends on the circumstance. Is the proposition fundamentally the same, or can it be argued in the circumstances of the time that it is a different proposition? And, you know, I would have to look at that. I would have to look at that in the circumstances of the time. But is it a relevant factor to be considered? Of course it is. That's why I have articulated the Convention in the way in which I have done. Yes, indeed. Point of order, Mr. Tom Brake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, Mr. Speaker, I'm wondering if you are able to update the House on any sanctions that might have been applied since 1604 to any governments that have sought to retable the same motion, and what such sanctions might be available to you today. And also, I wanted your reassurance, Mr. Speaker, that clearly we have, over a number of months, tabled a succession of amendments in relation to a people's vote, and I just wanted clarity from you that there's nothing in terms of what you said that would preclude us pressing another amendment on the matter of a people's vote.
The Right Honourable Gentleman who asked me, it depends on the context, it depends on the circumstances. I can't yet know in what situation a proposition might be put. When the Right Honourable Gentleman asks me about sanctions, I think what I would say to you is I'm not aware of any particular sanctions other than that if a proposition is judged to be the same or substantially the same, it doesn't find its way onto the order paper. There may be instances in which this has been dishonoured or inadvertently neglected, but I referenced in my statement the fact that the absence of Speaker intervention since 1920 is attributable not to the discontinuation of the Convention, but to general compliance with it. For the most part, the Convention has not been invoked in respect of governments, but I would argue that that is not least because, on the whole, governments have tended to comply with the Convention. Point of order, James Cleverly.
Speaker, I'm obliged. Hindsight is a wonderful thing. Do you, sir, concede that had you made this statement in fundamentally the same way as you made today, between the first and the second presentation of a meaningful vote, there might be members in this House perhaps believing that the second meaningful vote was the last opportunity they might have to vote positively on this, could have indeed changed their mind. And might I And might I also inquire, sir, that as we have seen sometimes in particularly fast-moving negotiations, that there may be changes, substantial, if subtle, changes in the agreement during the stage of the debate and before the vote. And in that instance, how, sir, would you assess that in terms of the validity of another presentation of a meaningful vote?
The latter point of the honourable gentleman is nuanced, and I think that it would be sensible to say, I'm afraid, because it will disappoint him, but it happens to have the advantage of being true, that I would have to look at the particulars. I cannot possibly be expected to pontificate or even to speculate idly on an abstract proposition. I would have to look at the reality of what was on the table. But what I say to the honourable gentleman in respect of his first point, and I have always had a great fondness for the honourable gentleman, is that although the Speaker tries to be helpful to the House, it is not my responsibility, and I would not ordinarily be expected, to hold members' hands in advising them of how they should vote in a particular circumstance. Members are perfectly capable of making these judgments for themselves. And the reason why I didn't make a statement at an earlier stage, I say in terms which brook of no misunderstanding, is that no such statement was required, for the simple reason that I adduced in my statement that the second vote on March the 12th and the debate that preceded it were entirely proper. There was not a breach of the convention. So for the honourable gentleman to say that it would have been helpful if I had said what I didn't say at a time that I could have said it, because it might have assisted members who, as a result of it not being said, weren't helped, is not altogether helpful, and I'm not sure that I would say that his logic is impeccable. I'm not sure that I would say his logic is impeccable. Point of order, Mr. Stephen Doughty.
Mr. Speaker, and thank you for your statement today. The government, Mr. Speaker, has gained an infamous historical reputation for trickery and abuse of Parliament during this whole process. And there are rumours already going around that they might seek to use the method of prorogation as a way of getting out of this. Now, not only would that provoke a greater constitutional crisis, but would you confirm, Mr. Speaker, that it would also result in losing every single piece of legislation currently before both houses, including many of the pieces of legislation needed to implement any Brexit?
Carryover, that would not apply, but in the expectation, let us say, or simply, I will use a more neutral term, in the circumstance that particular legislation was not subject to the carryover procedure, manifestly and incontrovertibly, it would fall. As to whether the government is contemplating that, I have no way of knowing. No minister has indicated that to me. I've no idea what is in their mind. It would be an unusual step, but look, I've been in this place now a little over 20 years and some quite unusual things have happened. I've no way of knowing whether this is being contemplated. Point of order, Sir Robert Sims.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In 1604 and in 1920, we were a sovereign parliament, and we were not subject to the EU constitution, which this House voted for under the Lisbon Treaty. And this House has passed legislation under Article 50 in order for us to leave the European Union, which is time sensitive. Now, Parliament could go in a rather stately manner in 1920 because it wasn't subject to such things, but we actually, as a Parliament, have voted to leave on a particular date, and therefore there is a certain importance that decisions are made prior to that date and not in the next session. Secondly, the meaningful vote in itself is a constitutional innovation. It was this Parliament trying to impose on the government greater parliamentary scrutiny. In that process, the government has brought forward votes, in fact more votes than most of us expected, and with more amendments than most of us expected, and I think there was a degree of constitutional innovation, I think, in what you ruled in that process, Mr. Speaker, in order to involve Parliament. I can see no reason if, because of the time nature of the proposition, and because this Parliament wanted to be involved, why we shouldn't be put through the pain of maybe another vote, because of the time-sensitive nature of this particular proposal. And I would stress Article 50 went through this House. The Withdrawal Act went through this House. Every member of this House expects to have a say on the type of Brexit that we actually are going to undertake. And even if we are dealing with an issue which has been dealt with before, it is sometimes important that this House makes a decision or decides not to make a decision, but not to consider the matter again could in itself have consequences.
And one has to reflect on the particulars. What I would say to the right honourable gentleman is that the issue is not the pain of any vote, which is a subjective matter upon which I don't think I should pontificate, especially as I don't cast such, other than in the circumstances of a tie, which has not arisen, I think, since 1993 in this chamber, but its propriety. The issue is not the pain of a vote, but its propriety. It is absolutely true that the House has legislated in respect of Article 50. I believe it did so in March 2017 in the last Parliament, and that has created a very strong expectation. That is entirely true. But whether Parliament chooses to legislate on this matter, or as the government has signalled in recent days, depending upon circumstance, to request a particular extension, is a matter for the House. I don't think that the issue of pain really comes into it. It's just a question of what is proper. And I know that the honourable gentleman, whom I've known since we competed with each other in Bristol South in June 1989, is a stickler for propriety. Well, I think it would be unseemly for me to say. Unseemly for me to say. I'm asked who won. Well, it's not seemly for me to say. I think the honourable gentleman's result at the 1992 election was rather better than mine. Point of order, Kate Hoey.
Speaker, and obviously we fully endorse your statement and respect it. But could I just ask for a point of clarification, or would it be in order to ask, but that I'm sure people out there will be asking when they read this today. On January the 29th, the House of Commons voted against the SNP Plaid Cymru amendment by 327 votes to 39, which ruled out an extension of the Article 50 period and ruled out no deal. So, I mean, we obviously voted again on that last week. Could you just perhaps clarify why that wouldn't have fallen into the same ruling?
I would have to look back at those particular votes. I didn't receive advice at that time about non-compliance, and I don't think there was a general sense in the House that there was an issue of non-compliance, and I wasn't asked to rule on it. Matters are already treated of by the Table Office on the basis of established custom and practice, and if those matters were accepted onto the paper, the issue of selection was an issue of selection for me in the interest of facilitating the debate, but the issue of propriety was not raised with me at that time. Yes, indeed. Point of order, Sir Hugo Swire.
Most grateful to you, Mr. Speaker. Most people watching our deliberations watch them with increased amazement, frankly. They don't understand the nuances of the twists and changes of the way we go about our business here. And to many of them, what we do at the moment makes very little sense at all. Yeah. They want to get on with things.
That's true.
So can I ask you, Mr. Speaker, as the custodian of the reputation of this House, whether you really think in bringing this ruling today at this stage rather than perhaps last week, because many of us are looking forward to trying to vote again one way or another this week, and perhaps you could inform the House as to how you came to this opinion and when, whether it would have been better at the time of the second vote to have announced that this was not time to have a third vote.
I agree.
Well, I am a little taken aback by the inquiry from the right honourable gentleman. I think I signalled to the honourable gentleman, the member for Braintree, why I didn't think that any statement was required at that time. It is, of course, true that the House passed a motion on Thursday that specified a potential end date for an agreement to be reached, and it specified that if an agreement was reached by that date, a particular extension, I think if memory serves me to the end of June to Article 50, would be requested of the Union. Why did I not say anything at that time? That was a motion passed, but it wasn't the motion in respect of the withdrawal agreement. and I could have had no way of knowing at that time whether revisions to the agreement or accompanying declaration would be sought, let alone obtained. So I can be expected to rule only at the material time. And if I had ruled, I hope the Right Honourable Gentleman will forgive me because I know he has a great sense of fair play. If I had ruled last week, I think I can say with complete confidence that there would have been people accusing me of being hasty and premature and commending to me the idea of waiting. And I thought that it was appropriate to reflect on the matter over a period of days. And what I'm saying before the government has tabled a new proposition. So it seems to me timely to say it now rather than to wait several days. But to have done so several days ago did not seem to me to be warranted. I have made my best judgment in the interests of the House as an institution and of its individual members. Yes, indeed. A point of order, Mrs. Helen Goodman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you are obviously right that the House does not wish to vote on the same proposition over and over again. Equally, I'm sure you will be aware of the fact that some honourable members were interested in meaningful votes because they would be able to vote on amendments on matters which we have not yet considered as at that time. Now, if the government is unable to make any changes to their proposition, I'm seeking your guidance as to how we might secure opportunities for voting on those alternative propositions. I heard you talk about urgent questions, but of course there's no vote on an urgent question or a statement, and a Standing Order 24 is a motion in neutral terms. The government has not been very generous recently in offering opposition day debates either. So I'm just really seeking your advice on how honourable members might proceed.
Obviously it would be helpful to the opposition if opposition days were supplied, and that hasn't happened recently, and I've no way of knowing whether the Leader of the House has it in mind to provide for opposition days. I think colleagues would think that it was a democratic and seemly thing to do to ensure that the principal opposition party had the requisite allocation of days. So far as other business is concerned, what I would say to the Honourable Lady is that she should look closely at the Standing Order number 24 procedure. What she says about it is true, but I think that she should reflect upon the opportunities that the Standing Order number 24 procedure presents, because the opportunities are fuller than has traditionally been acknowledged or taken advantage of by members of the House of Commons. Point of order, Mr. John Whittingdale.
Mr. Speaker, you helpfully reminded us at the beginning of your statement of the size of the majority against the vote which took place last week. I think most observers would feel that in order for that to be turned around and for the motion to pass, it would require a significant change. And as I understand from your ruling this afternoon, if perhaps at the European Council in a few days' time a significant change could be achieved, then you would allow a further meaningful vote on that basis.
The Right Honourable Gentleman is very fair-minded, and what's more, he's perceptive. I think I hinted at that, perhaps not with the crystal clarity that the Right Honourable Gentleman has brought to bear on the subject, but in essence he's right. If there is a substantially different proposition put as a result of revisions sought and obtained and new agreement reached, that would constitute a new proposition to be put to the House. I would have to look at the particulars, and I'm not committing to a specific at this moment, but I think nobody could outdo the Right Honourable Gentleman today by way of reasonableness. Well, a Kingston knight, no less. Point of order, Sir Edward Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In our current constitutional crisis, can I welcome your reaffirmation of the rule of law in this House, namely Erskine May, and the doctrine of parliamentary sovereignty? Given the gravity of the situation, though, could you enlighten the House as to whether Erskine May makes any provision for a Speaker's conference to bring together all parties in this House under your chairmanship, sir, to try to find a way forward?
Well, there can always be speakers' conferences, though I must say, and I don't direct this particularly at this government at all, it is a wider observation, it is a perhaps curious and quaint fact that ordinarily speakers' conferences are convened at the instigation of the government of the day. Indeed, I recall a particular occasion some years ago when I had some interest in the possibility of a speakers' conference on aspects of parliamentary power. If I say to the right honourable gentleman that the reaction at the time to my suggestion of the then Leader of the House was not wildly enthusiastic, I think I would be somewhat understating the position. But that was then, and maybe the new Leader of the House, or relatively new Leader of the House, who has been a notable reformer in other respects, will be seized by the salience of what the right honourable gentleman has commended to the House, and will feel that she could have a key role in initiating such an important constitutional development. And if she did, you know, I would be perfectly willing to play ball with it. I've no idea. It's not something she and I have discussed, but you never know. You never know. Point of order, the Leader of the House.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, I just want to be very clear. I am indeed a reforming Leader of the House of Commons, and for me, treating colleagues with courtesy and respect is at the forefront of that reform, and any Speaker's Council would have to have that at its heart, and I simply would not be confident that that would be the case.
Well, so be it. I treat the House with respect. I've treated its members with respect. I chaired a previous Speakers' Conference, and there was no criticism of the way in which I did so. One reason why the Leader of the House might not be well versed in that particular Speakers' Conference and in a position to make a judgment about my chairmanship of it is very simply that it took place before the Right Honourable Lady entered the House of Commons.
Point of order.
Point of order, Dr. Matthew Offord.
This House runs on conventions, as you've already made clear in your statement today. And one of those conventions is that the Treasury bench always tells the opposition bench of statements they are going to make. So to clarify this, Mr. Speaker, can you confirm to the House that you not only informed the Leader of the House of your intention to make this statement, but also told her the contents of your statement?
He can't confirm anything of the sort, and what I would say to the honourable gentleman is that his understanding about what might happen between the usual channels is one thing. That absolutely does not apply to Speaker's statements. And if the honourable gentleman shrugs and says, why not? That has never been the case. The Speaker of the House makes statements to the House at a time when the Speaker of the House thinks that they will be of interest and benefit to the House. I am under absolutely no obligation whatsoever to pre-announce that statement either to the Leader of the House or to the shadow Leader of the House, and I did not do so. And if the honourable gentleman, a keen student of parliamentary procedure, is offended by that fact, well, I'm sorry, and he is, of course, welcome to be offended. But there is absolutely no breach of parliamentary protocol or etiquette whatsoever. That is the reality, and I have explained the position in terms clear and unmistakable. Point of order, Mr. Grant-Davis.
Mr. Speaker, can you confirm that a meaningful vote would be intrinsically different if it included the provision for a confirmatory vote by way of a public vote?
Again, I'd have to look at the particulars. I would look at the specifics, I would assess what was being proposed, and I would make a judgment about it. I prefer at this stage to rest on what I have already said about the principle that something should be different, not the same or substantially the same. I would have to look at the specifics and the circumstances of the time. Point of order, Carol Monaghan.
Mr. Speaker, we are now 11 days, 6 hours 21 minutes and about 40 seconds from leaving. This can be described as nothing other than a constitutional crisis. So, can you advise, Mr. Speaker, how we can bring forward an emergency motion on revoking Article 50?
Well, emergency motions, and I say this as much for the benefit of people observing our proceedings as for members of the House, are capable of being requested under Standing Order number 24. The Honourable Lady will know that any member can apply for the right to conduct a Standing Order number 24 motion, can conduct a Standing Order number 24 debate on a motion, and that request is, in the first instance, submitted to me. If I decide that the application can be made in a speech of up to 3 minutes, it is made on the floor of the House. If I decide that the application is valid and the application is supported, then the debate can take place, and there's nothing to stop such debates taking place in the ensuing days. Many have taken place before, obviously on nothing like the scale of urgent questions, but many have taken place before, and I have no reason to suppose that it will be different in the future. Yes, point of order, Alex Bercow. Thank you.
Does this House have the authority to suspend the standing orders that prevent motions being brought back to the House in the same form again?
The Clerk of the House confirms my own understanding, which is the House is the custodian of its own standing orders. The standing orders are a matter for the House, and those standing orders can be changed. That has happened before, and conceivably it could happen again. So, in terms of the central inquiry, the answer is yes. Point of order, Hal Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is there any definition in terms of precedents of the meaning of the term substantial change? And if there is not, can you just confirm that that does not preclude you from making a novel decision?
I'm sorry if this disappoints the honourable gentleman, but it is context-specific, and it is a judgment for the Chair. And the Chair seeks to make a judgment on the basis of what is going to be in the interests of the House. I don't think I can say fairer than or different to that, and I hope that that is useful to colleagues. Point of order, Mark Pritchard.
I just wonder, for clarity, is it the case that you've not ruled out having a third meaningful vote? It is just a matter of that vote being conditional on other matters applying, in the motion as well as in the substance?
I think I explained the position to the right honourable gentleman, the member for Malden. It depends on the specific terms of what is proposed. And in answer to the honourable gentleman, forgive me, and I don't mean this discourteously in any way, I don't know whether he was here throughout our exchanges. Maybe he was. No, maybe he was, I don't know. But what I was seeking to convey was that a new proposition could be put, but the convention would militate against the same or substantially the same proposition being put. So I am not closing the door, and indeed I quite specifically said towards the end of my statement, this ruling should not be regarded as my last word on the subject. It is simply meant to indicate the test which the government must meet in order for me to rule that a third meaningful vote can legitimately be held in this parliamentary session. I don't see that I can expand upon that, nor should I be required today to do so.
To be helpful, well, I think the Speaker decides. The Speaker decides. So would your advice be to those that perhaps are getting exercise about this, don't panic?
Well, I'm always inclined to say don't panic. I'm not in the business of panicking myself. I think I can safely say I've never lost a wink of sleep over any work-related matter. There is no merit or purpose in doing so. I think we should approach these matters with calm, deploy reason, and seek to make sensible judgments, not just in our own interests and in the interests of the House, but of the people that we are sent here to represent. I've always done that, and I'm sure that that is what colleagues think it is right to do, including most certainly the honourable gentleman. If there are no further points of order, I'm most grateful to colleagues for the interest that they've shown and the inquiries they've put, and I thank them for their involvement. We come now to the urgent question. Janet Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In light of the recent terrorist attacks against the Muslim community of Christchurch, New Zealand, will the Minister make a statement on the government's strategy to tackle far-right violence and online extremism in the UK?
Minister Ben Wallace.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for asking the question so the government can set on record its position towards extreme right-wing neo-Nazi and other type of violent terrorism. Mr. Speaker, the Home Secretary would have liked to have responded personally to this urgent question. However, he was visiting Regent's Park's mosque with the Community Secretary today to show support for British Muslims following last week's horrific terrorist attack in Christchurch. The attack was a sickening act of terrorism which the government condemns, as we do the incident that's been reported in Utrecht today and the attack in Surrey on Saturday evening. Mr. Speaker, the government takes all forms of terrorism and extremism seriously. Our counter-terrorism strategy contest does not differentiate between what motivates the threat. It is designed to address all forms of terrorism, whatever the ideology, be it Islamist, neo-Nazi, far-right or extreme left-wing. If we are to tackle terrorism in the long term, Mr. Speaker, we must challenge those seeking to radicalise people. The PREVENT policy is designed to safeguard our vulnerable citizens from being recruited or motivated into terrorism. That is why I always urge people to get behind the policy. Our counter-terrorism strategy is agnostic to the threat. It is not relevant to us what name terror strikes. It is the use of violence and hate that we seek to stop. Government and law enforcement will direct its funding wherever the threat emerges, and if we are to stay one step ahead, as the threat changes, so must the funding. We will continue to keep funding for protective security measures under review as that threat moves, and will indeed consistently reviewed for places of worship and other areas that may be vulnerable. Mr. Speaker, social media platforms should be ashamed that they have enabled a terrorist to live stream this evil massacre and spread this mantra of hate to the whole world. As the Home Secretary has made clear, enough is enough. We've been clear that tech companies need to act more quickly to remove terrorist content and ultimately prevent new content being made available to users in the first place. This must be a wake-up call for them to do more. There can be no safe spaces for terrorists to promote and share their sick views. The online harm white paper will be published imminently, and it will set out clear expectations for tech companies to keep users safe and what will happen if they fail to do so. Mr. Speaker, this government takes the growing threat of the extreme right wing extremely seriously, and I can assure the House and our Muslim communities that we will stand together to counter it wherever it manifests itself in our society.
Janet Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week's terrorist attacks on mosques in New Zealand killed 50 people and wounded a further 50 people. I'm sure the whole House will join me in expressing our most sincere condolences to those who have lost their loved ones, as well as our solidarity with the people of New Zealand as they come to terms with this and also put in place legislation to prevent this from happening again. We've also seen this morning where a terrorist attack took place in the Netherlands, and we offer our sincere condolences to the 3 people that have died during that. In Lewisham, we have 5 mosques, and 2 of those are in my constituency, and I've been contacted about the very real concern. This type of racial hatred and violence, whether in the UK or elsewhere in the world, must not be tolerated and should not be tolerated. It brings with it such immense fear, worry and anxiety for our Muslim communities, for families, children and young people. This should not be happening to people in this country or in other countries, and this should not be how people live. And the government needs to demonstrate everything is being considered and done to keep people safe from harm promoting respect, acceptance of difference and others. Will the Minister therefore state how his department will deal with social media offences, including the removal of extreme content, protect free speech while developing an efficient strategy to tackle hate speech online? Also, will he confirm if he will be increasing his commitment to financing mosque security?
Minister Ben Wallace.
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady makes some very valid points. First of all, on the protect, the space, the money we fund to protect vulnerable places, whether that is places of worship or schools or indeed where anyone else gathers in large public areas, we of course continue to fund that where the threat requires it. We are going to review and continue to review the Places of Worship Fund. The last round, 18-19, was not oversubscribed despite efforts to advertise that to a number of mosques and other places of worship, and we will continue to build on that. And if there is more requirement for that, we will certainly stand ready to do that, to make sure that my constituents in Preston in their mosques and the Honourable Lady's constituents in theirs get the support they need. It is also the case, Mr. Speaker, that in every single police force there is a national counter-terrorism security advisor located within that force whose job is to go out and advise businesses, communities and places of worship about what they can do to mitigate any threat, even if it is threat unseen, but how they can make sure that the people that use their premises are kept safe. And I do urge people to do that. On top of that, the National Counter-Terrorism Security Office publishes an online manual to help places of worship, specifically with tailor-made areas. But the Home Secretary and the Community Secretary is absolutely determined to make sure that the threat we have seen in New Zealand, those type of attacks, are headed off. There are different factors at play in the United Kingdom. But nevertheless, as I have said this morning, it is perfectly possible in the future that these type of things will happen here. We are already seeing a growing threat from people moving into the extremist mindset in the extreme right wing and neo-Nazis, and that is the pool that terrorists of the future will recruit from. And unless all of us get together to make sure that we learn and teach our children about tolerance, about equality, and making sure that we understand that because someone disagrees with us, they are not lesser people. Because they come from a different religion, they are not lesser, and because they come from a different colour, they're not lesser. Until we embrace that, extremism will grow, and that's the best way we're going to head off far-right neo-Nazi extremism.
Sir Paul Beresford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With a New Zealand passport in my left pocket, can I thank the House, and in fact the nation, who, with a very few exceptions, were extremely sympathetic, and it was spread throughout the media. Mr. Speaker, although the New Zealand Armed Forces and sports teams, such as the All Blacks, are fearsome in the field, as a nation, the people are known for their friendliness, acceptance of different races, of colours and religions. What is most disturbing is that even with such community integration, a case such as last week, which could not happen in New Zealand, did. The All Blacks I've just mentioned are a positive example, as they are of different races, colours and religions, but are brilliantly effective as playing as a team. On a positive point, if I could put to the Minister, I'm sure he will agree that our gun laws are very much tighter at the moment, at least in New Zealand, if not probably all nations. Would he agree that those are sufficient, but the difficulty is the importation of illegal weapons, and will he go for that rather than changing the gun laws?
Minister.
My honourable friend, as a New Zealander and a Brit, makes a valid point about the strength of the New Zealand nation. He makes the correct observation that the gun laws in this country make it much harder for people to acquire weapons that could reap murder, mass murder, in a very quick time, such as we've seen with the use of semi-assault rifles in places such as New Zealand and the United States. But that does not mean we should ever stop making sure that where those type of threats present themselves, we put all our resource and, if necessary, our legislation to restrict where necessary. I have to say that while I see many people considering those type of attacks, they have been unsuccessful in this country because they simply have not been able to get their hands on the type of weapon system we saw deployed in New Zealand, and our law enforcement agencies will continue to target both legal acquisition of weapons by unsuitable people and illegal acquisition through smuggling, so that we can make sure that our places are safer.
Nick Thomas-Symonds.
Mr Speaker, thank you for granting this urgent question, and credit to my honourable friend for Lewisham East for applying for it. And I join all members in passing on condolences to the family and friends of those murdered in this heinous act of terror against people for no other reason other than that they were Muslims. We send sympathy to the people of New Zealand, to those affected by the incident in Surrey and the ongoing situation in Utrecht. As the Leader of the Opposition has said, an attack on anyone at worship is an attack on all peoples of faith and non-believers too, going about their lawful, peaceful business. The harrowing live streaming of events in Christchurch on the other side of the world raises questions about the role of social media platforms in facilitating a growing extremism. And whilst a white paper on online harm is of course welcome, does the Minister now accept that the time has come when asking online platforms to act is not enough, and we need a new regulator with strong powers to penalise them if they do not curb harmful content? We must also ensure our laws and policies are robust and up to date. Can the Minister clarify when the new independent reviewer of terrorism legislation will be appointed and in post? And can he also confirm that in the forthcoming independent review of the Prevent programme, lessons will be learned from both domestic and international experience? I'm not suggesting, Mr Speaker, that any political perspective has a monopoly on virtue. Rather, Mr Speaker, does the Minister agree that acts of vile hatred like this one show that we must on all sides redouble our efforts to argue for a society of tolerance and respect?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The honourable gentleman makes many points that I agree with, and tolerance and respect and the underpinning of British values of democracy and the rule of law are absolutely vital in our society, and the more we teach our children about that and the more we clamp down on those that don't believe in that, I think the better place we will be. As to his questions on the future to be appointed at some stage Prevent reviewer, independent reviewer, I can't speak for that person until we do it. No, the independent review of terrorism, we'll get to that as well. You did mention the Prevent review. I can't answer for that. However, when it comes to the review of Prevent, I want that person to be as free as possible to examine people's views, people's perceptions and people's evidence. I will hopefully would like that those who criticise Prevent the most actually produce evidence rather than anecdote at some of these events. And of course, the government will listen to whatever result. On the independent review of terrorism, it is a matter of hopefully days or weeks to do so. We are very, very advanced on the stages of selecting one, and like him, I would be grateful, I'd be very quick, I'd like to have one as soon as possible. No government benefits without a review of terrorism legislation. On the issue of new regulations to online harms, he will, I am afraid, and I know the benches opposite will be impatient, have to wait for the online harms white paper to be published. It will obviously in there examine regulation versus voluntary, and I have been on the record on numerous occasions saying that I believe that voluntary is not enough and regulation or other methods of encouragement should be explored. I've also been very clear that these online companies, many of them, are global, hugely profitable and global, and therefore whatever regulation we explore will have to be deliverable. And that's why I met with the G7 in Toronto last year to discuss what collectively the G7 can do. It's why the Home Secretary and his predecessor chairs the Global Internet Forum to make sure that countries all around the world can get to grips with this problem, and also why the European Union is taking forward plans to seek regulation in certain areas, especially around timing to take down content. Because if we are to deal with it, Brexit. We do have to build an international layering approach, in my view, to regulation. Otherwise, companies will just simply move their servers or indeed escape their obligations. And it is one thing for the big companies who have a nexus here, for example, to be dealt with, but there are lots of tiny companies spreading hate around the world who may have servers in jurisdictions we cannot get to. And that is why we will have to make sure we build an international consensus to deal with the challenges.
Sir Peter Bottomley. The House will welcome the calm, purposeful way my right honourable friend has spoken here in the House this afternoon and his broadcast this morning, matched, I think, by the opposition spokesman who has shown that this is a community task. It's not just other faiths, it's the whole community who have to stand with the Muslims as we stand with the Jews. And can I in particular ask my right honourable friend if he'll go on encouraging the CST, the Community Security Trust, to share with our mosques and Islamic societies the basic steps that people can take themselves within the law to try to help raise levels of confidence and security.
My right honourable friend makes the strongest point of all, that we'll defeat this through peer group pressure and coming together to show what is not acceptable. The work that the Community Safety Trust has already offered, it's downloaded as online material to help advise other places of worship in how they can make themselves safe. But it is the fact that our law enforcement cannot do it on their own. The current threat is from sudden violent extremists, people who in minutes can step outside their front door, grab a knife or a car and wreak murder on our streets. That is not going to be spotted by a police officer on every corner or a large intelligence service without the support of the public, who themselves can understand their neighbours and make sure that when they have worries, they bring it to the attention of the correct authorities to make sure we say this is not acceptable.
Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No one who has ever visited New Zealand can fail to have been struck by the beauty of its country, but also the very warm welcome one gets from its diverse people, as the Honourable Member from Morro Valley has said. So on behalf of the Scottish National Party, I'd like to condemn the terrible evil we saw in New Zealand last week and to send our heartfelt condolences to the bereaved and injured. In Scotland, our Muslim community are a valued part of Scottish society, as they are across the whole of the United Kingdom. But we must always be aware of the particular threat posed to our Muslim community from far-right extremists. And I'm sure the Minister will agree with me that Islamophobia must be combated and condemned wherever it raises its head. Does he also agree with me that politicians, journalists and those in the public eye should always be cautious never to cross the line between free speech and fair comment, to risk stirring up the sort of hatred and othering that can feed into the narrative of the far right? There have been a growing number of incidents across the UK in recent years, and it was really good to hear the Minister on the radio this morning and this afternoon saying that he's alive to that threat and will put resources into it. I noticed on the radio this morning that the Muslim Council of Great Britain are very concerned that their community should get the same sort of funding as the Jewish community have received to protect their places of worship against attack. And I was pleased to hear the Minister say on the radio that protective security tacks with the threat present. And it seems to me that the Minister does recognise the threat, but will he confirm that he will be meeting with the Muslim Council of Great Britain to discuss their requests and to look at directing funds where needed? And finally, Mr. Speaker, we've seen incidents of far-right extremists trying to intimidate and silence members of this House who've called them out for their hate. In particular, my honourable friend, the member for Glasgow South, has suffered at the hands of far-right extremists recently. I know the government have been very sympathetic about this, but does he agree with me that all of us across this House must stand united with our colleagues against the threat from the far right?
Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Lady makes some good points, and her point about Islamophobia, I have publicly spoken out for many years about the fact Islamophobia exists. It exists across our communities. It exists in all our political parties. It exists in our communities that we represent, and it exists throughout Europe and not just the United Kingdom, and we have to tackle it. And if you want a good lesson, Mr. Speaker, on how to tackle intolerance, I remember one of the early successful policies of the Scottish National Party was dealing with anti-sectarianism, because the SNP recognised in Scotland that it starts with sectarianism and it grows into violent extremism. And the work, I have to commend the SNP for what they did all those years ago around that, and took strong steps, certainly amongst the football community, to stamp it out. And that is why, in the end, you have to focus upstream. You focus in the communities and say what is not acceptable, and you embrace, in my view, such policies as prevent, to make sure everyone realises it's ultimately about safeguarding. On the issue of the community trust, she's absolutely right. We will direct our funds as the threat changes, and we are completely open to learning every day from the attacks or the plots that we see either here or abroad, and we shall certainly direct it at that way. My colleagues in government regularly speak with a range of Muslim communities. Many of us in this House will speak with our own communities and our own constituencies, and we will sense the current fear that there is in some of those communities as a response to the New Zealand attack. But even before that, with the growing rise of Islamophobia spread through the evils of some of these chat rooms on the internet, and if we don't all of us say that is not acceptable, as is intolerance aimed at other people in other discourse around the world, whether that is unionism, nationalism, Brexit, Remain. Intolerance is where it starts as a small seed and it grows into hate.
John Whittingdale.
Can I welcome my right friend's statement and strongly agree with him that the tech companies do need to do more to stop the spread of hate and incitement to violence. However, will he also recognise that the internet is a force for good, and that many authoritarian countries, China and now particularly Russia, are attempting to impose censorship on it for their own repressive political purposes? Does he therefore agree that any measures we take need to be proportionate and targeted, and must not allow other countries like Russia to claim somehow that they are acting for similar reasons to ourselves?
Mr. Speaker, it's tempting to say to my right honourable friend, you're asking the wrong person, as the Security Minister who sees daily paedophiles, organised crime, groomers, terrorist recruiters using the internet not for a force for good. It is being used as we speak to undermine our own democracy. But he makes a valid point. In places where there is no democracy, there is no rule of law, it is their only hope sometimes, the ability to engage with free thought, to engage with the outside world. And we have to be very careful how we balance that. But nevertheless, what we know is that when these companies put their mind to it, they can remove extremist content very quickly. And there are certain areas that all of us are in agreement. Child sexual exploitation images. I can't find anyone in the world who would support allowing that to exist on our internet. Violent extremism, beheading videos, bullying online. That cannot be acceptable in any society. And I think there is certainly a number of activities that we all can agree should not be allowed or able to be on our internet without someone taking responsibility for the broadcast of it or indeed the spreading of it. And that's the fine line that we will all on this House have to try and navigate when the online white papers comes before us, and we can have debates around that.
Angela Regal.
Mr. Speaker, will the Minister admit that the internet has allowed the formation of chat rooms such as 4chan and 8chan, online communities such as the incels, those involuntary celibates who are misogynistic and blame women for their lack of access to sex, and also the bubbles where both ISIS and now we've seen neo-Nazi far-right white supremacist groups gather their followers. And does he acknowledge and does he have a plan for dealing with the grooming and the escalation of evil and violence that is growing in these unregulated spaces?
The Right Honourable lady makes absolutely the right point, and there are a lot of characteristics across the spectrum of extremists, violent extremists, whether that is Islamist, Daesh, ISIL extremists, or far right. They often use the same methods. They often appeal to sometimes the same type of people. It is also the case that both this side of the House and her front bench have been grappling with how we deal with safe spaces, either in the material world or indeed on the online world, because it is, a characteristic of the 21st century is this safe space concept, failed state or the internet, where these people are reinforcing their prejudice and joining up. You could argue 10 years ago people sat in their bedrooms on their own and spoke to no one. Now they can speak to thousands, and that is being used to seduce people, to groom people, and to twist people. So we start in our schools, and that's why I am pleased that both the state and local education authorities and primary schools start teaching children about safe use of the internet, but also, actually, some of these big CSPs, Google, Facebook, etc., do go out to schools and start that process at a young age about teaching those children about how to behave on an internet and what to be careful of. But it is a growing challenge. The online white paper hopefully will be the doorway for which we can all go through and start a big debate about how we can tackle it. But also there is this simple issue that all of us have to think about what we're looking at, what our children are looking at, what our friends are looking at actually, and ask ourselves, how are we going to stop this in this day and age where how many people in this chamber at any one time are on their telephone? Quite an awful lot.
Vicky Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Saturday morning, I met Muslim families from all over Essex who'd come to Chelmsford to meet each other. And I spoke to many leaders of the community, but also young teenage girls and other younger members of the community. And it's very clear that they're very fearful and very worried. Will my right honourable friend confirm that our Muslim constituents are our friends, our neighbours, our colleagues? They are vital to British society today, and that we as parliamentarians and members of the government will do everything to stand by them and keep them safe.
British Muslims are part of Britain. That's it. They are no lesser than any one of us. We are all the same. We all share different politics, all share different views. We all have views of the north and the south. You live in Lancashire, I have an entirely different view of the south. And my Muslims and communities in Lancashire will have a different view of the south as well. We stand shoulder to shoulder. We're not going to let these people spread their hate. We will put all the resource we need to counter it. And it's very, very much incumbent on all of us across the House to do it together. Because if we don't do it together, the bad people will exploit that difference and make it worse.
Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Friday night, hundreds of local residents in Walthamstow joined together in a vigil for the people of Christchurch, hearing from both our Muslim community and our New Zealand residents. And many of them were clear with me that they recognise that far-right extremism doesn't come talking about Hitler and wearing jackboots. It comes from those people who slowly drip the poison online and offline into our politics and into our discussions. And therefore it is behoving on all of us in this place to stand up to the people who lead that charge. So will the Minister tell us what he intends to do when he recognises this twisted mindset to make sure that nobody in this place gives a platform and a veneer of respectability to people like Steve Bannon, Candace Owens and Fraser Anning? Let's say they're not welcome here in this chamber and here in our country.
Minister.
The Honourable Lady presents one of the biggest challenges of today. But it is, you see that, Mr. Speaker, that is actually an immature comment, really, from someone from a sedentary position. The reality is, when we talk about tolerance, we talk about not no platforming, not shutting people up we disagree with. We talk about a discourse where we challenge people's views, because only in challenging people's views Do we get to sometimes the heart of the argument and either come together or agree to disagree? If we shut people down or bully people or ridicule people, you are leading the path of intolerance. I personally find sometimes other people invited to this House unpalatable, but I don't think it is my place to shut people out of the heart of our democracy. The way we show them up is by challenging their assertions, proving it to be wrong, and taking their arguments apart. That's the best way.
Julia Lopez.
The Minister is aware I was a councillor in Tower Hamlets at a time when young school children were groomed to go to Syria, and also we had far-right marches going through the borough. And it was clear from my time there just how important Prevent is in terms of giving children intellectual resilience to resist those kinds of radical and unpleasant and divisive messages. Unfortunately, however, we've seen that too often people try and spread misinformation about Prevent. Does he share my concern that politicians challenge that misinformation so that communities feel greater confidence in Prevent and feel confident enough to share the kind of critical information that stops people from falling prey to this kind of radicalisation?
Minister.
I felt that the best way for us to deal with Prevent is to publish the statistics about who is referred, how it works, and what are the outcomes. And, you know, I think that's the best way. And no doubt, when we have an independent review of Prevent, they can examine all the evidence from both sides and make a view. The only observation I have about Prevent is I've listened to the critics over the last 2.5 years. Some of them are my friends. And when they explain, they often just explain the Prevent policy, but actually worry about the name of it. Now, that can't just be about the name, it has to be about the substance as well. And I see good results in Prevent. I've seen hundreds of people over the last 3 years who were really, really at risk of becoming terrorists, being diverted from that path, and that's over 700 people in the last 3 years who I think contribute to us being a safer society.
Sir Edward Davey.
I send on behalf of the Liberal Democrats our sincere condolences to the victims and their families and all the people of New Zealand, and say that we stand with them and all our Muslim brothers and sisters worldwide in unity. Mr. Speaker, will the Minister condemn without reservation Islamophobic language, whether used by individuals or in the media? Liberal Democrats have looked at the proposed definition of Islamophobia from the all-party parliament group of British Muslims, and we think it's a very good one and have adopted it. Will the government do likewise?
I condemn Islamophobia. It is racism. It's like no other. It's just like any other type of racism, right? And we shouldn't even subdivide it. It is what it is. It's racism. It's like anti-Semitism is racism. So I'm not going to. I don't need to go beyond that. And anyone who is caught doing it should be called out and dealt with, whether that's in my political party or any other political party. I have absolutely no qualms with that, and they should be dealt with. On the definition of Islamophobia, I read the report that the all-party group produced. I looked at their definition. It is an interesting and good starting point. My right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, chaired, I think on the 5th of March, a round table with himself and the committee secretaries and members of the Muslim community to discuss Islamophobia and what can be done in it. We are going to look at the definition and what we can do to start in that process. But I think a lot of this, all of this, Mr. Speaker, comes back to if we over-define, if we start subdividing Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, we forget what it's really about, which is tolerance. And I think it's really, really important that we accept that we are tolerant of people. That is really what underlines extremism. Where people choose not to be tolerant, they start to become extremists. And when they think they're lesser, then that's where we're in trouble.
Robert Halfon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I express compassion and solidarity of all Muslims from New Zealand and across the world, and in my constituency of Harlow. In my constituency, we have a wonderful, thriving Harlow Islamic Centre, a small community but thriving one. But in 2013, there was an arson attack in 2013 on the Harlow Islamic Centre Mosque. Could I, honourable friend, just reset out what provision and support there is, not for the bigger mosque, but for smaller mosque and thriving communities like Harlow, to ensure that there aren't these kind of attacks happening in the future?
Minister.
Well, first of all, my honourable friend, in the Metropolitan Police, there is counter-terrorism security advisors who will come out to any mosque or any place to help advise them on what steps can be taken to do that. There's also the Places of Worship scheme, 2.4 million over the last 3 years, which can be applied for. The latest round was not fully subscribed, and we will do all we can to advertise it, encourage it. And indeed, my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, and I previously have looked at different ways we can remove barriers to people applying for that to make it as easy and straightforward as possible. And we hope to improve that even more. Because, like you, in my constituency, I have some very small mosques. And they are just as vulnerable as some of the very big ones, and we must make sure that protective security applies to us all.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I also add my party's the DUP sympathies to all those who were killed and injured in New Zealand in the very, very vicious terrorist attack. Coming as I do from Northern Ireland, that we have experienced unadulterated evil of people slaughtering worshippers and what should be a safe place. For example, in the Gospel Hall in Darkley on the 20th of November 1983. In the face of evil, it is time for good people to stand with those who have been attacked. So can the Minister confirm what support has been offered to New Zealand in relation to policing and forensic expertise and victims and counselling support for those victims who have lost loved ones?
Minister. My honourable friend knows all too well the cost of terrorism and indeed the society that he lives in, the cost of division. We have offered to the New Zealand authorities any help they wish, either in the intelligence space or indeed in the police space, and we will continue to do that, as we will with the Netherlands today. Ultimately, we've got to make sure that when it comes to saying what is acceptable or not acceptable, linking violence and politics is not acceptable. And that is a good start point that we must make very clear across our political discourse, that the first point is that is never acceptable, never to evoke it, never to ask, never to say people should be lynched, and never, ever evoke violence in the same mouthful as politics.
Dr. Matthew Offord.
Mr. Speaker, I feel it's a matter of some regret that this urgent question has been framed as right-wing extremist, because there are also left-wing extremists. This is simply terrorism, pure and simple. And I'm very proud that my first question in this House was to ask for the finances to provide security at Jewish schools in my Hendon constituency. And indeed, the Community Security Trust is based in Hendon and actually provides that security. But now we need to make the same call on behalf of Muslim schools and Islamic institutions in our constituencies. So can I ask the Minister if he would take that back to the Treasury and the communities and local government to ask that resources are made available to these communities, because any kind of extremism is not acceptable.
Minister. My honourable friend is right, and as I said in the statement, as the threat moves, we will tack with it. We absolutely will. First of all, the first point to call my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, is within the department, and then obviously onto the Treasury, that we are determined to make all of our places of worship safe, and we'll do what's necessary.
Stephen Doughty.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I too visited mosques and had contact with my local Muslim leaders on Friday, and there was a real palpable sense of fear. And I want to praise South Wales Police for the work they did in responding so quickly, and our Police and Crime Commissioner. And I was particularly disturbed to speak to young people firsthand who told me they were watching the video of the horrific attacks in New Zealand, and we have to do everything we can to prevent young people from having to see such horrific content. But on that note, I do have to push the Minister and the Home Secretary further, because I don't doubt their sincerity in wanting to deal with these issues, but saying we need to wait for that online harms white paper. I've raised with them both previously the issue of an organisation called Radio Aryan, which is available on Twitter, Facebook and YouTube. I've raised it with the social media companies directly, and it's absolutely clear they don't give a damn. That content is still on there this morning. It advocates anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, homophobia and white supremacy. Why is it still on there, and what is the government going to do to remove it?
Well, as I said earlier in an earlier answer, one of the reasons these type of things still are there, because often some of these companies' services are currently, their servers are abroad and out of our jurisdiction. What we are seeking, and we will seek in this online white papers, are the powers to do something that we can do about that. And if some of those companies have a nexus in the UK, that gives us more power. If they don't, we would have to look at other technical issues about whether we can do it another way. it is imminently coming, this paper, and I will be really looking forward, happy to meet him and any member from across this House to discuss whether they think it's too soft or too hard or what needs to be done to improve it. But he does point out one of the real challenges. In the United States, the First Amendment, it protects their freedom of speech. Often we approach companies in America asking them to take down websites, etc., and we get a First Amendment response that they are obliged to the United States law and First Amendment, which is why ultimately we have to seek an international solution to go alongside whatever regulation we look at here.
Tom Tugendhat.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was particularly moved to hear this afternoon the Home Secretary using the Arabic words Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful. Because what we're fundamentally talking about here is a compassion and a mercy that was not shown to a community, this time within New Zealand, but sometimes at home, and a justice that we now need to extend to members of our own community who feel that they do not have access to the same security as others. I welcome the views that are going to come forward from the Home Secretary and from my rather honourable friend, the Security Minister, who's in his place, and I welcome the work that they have done. But making sure that these publishers, for that is what they are, who are putting up or are tolerating the publication of online hate material is absolutely the first line of defence, but not the last.
Minister.
I think the CSPs around the world need to get the message that we know that when they really want to do something, they seem to manage to do it. We know that their algorithms are often designed to maximise viewing and profits rather than maximising the safety of our constituents. And we need them to realise that we are onto that and we are going to do something about it. You know, last year, Facebook took down 14.3 million pieces of content, 99% of which was done by automated tools. Before all that, it took the government to set up something called the Counter-Terrorism Internet Referral Unit, not them, and that unit, on its own, managed to take down 300,000 pieces. If we can do it, those multi-billion global corporations can invest more into artificial intelligence and can do it much quicker.
Mr. David Hanson.
The UK Government currently chairs the Commonwealth Heads of Government, of which New Zealand is a proud member. In passing on our condolences and our thanks to the excellent work of Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister, would he agree to convene, as head of the Commonwealth Government at the moment, a discussion with the 53 nations about what we can do on Facebook and on Twitter to collectively close down extremist content across the Commonwealth?
Minister. The right honourable member is a very good suggestion. First of all, at the CHOGM that happened last year, it was in fact they did have a session or two on cyber, but I think his recommendation is a valid one, and I will nick it, if I may, and take it forward.
John Lamont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was reassured by the Minister's remarks about the work the Department's doing to help mosques and places of worship fight hate crime. But could you confirm that work extends to Scotland and to outline what discussions he's had with the Scottish Government in this regard?
Minister.
My understanding is things like place of worship is a devolved issue in Scotland, but I'm always in contact with both officials and indeed ministerial counterparts in Scotland, and I will continue to discuss it with them, and I'm due a visit there very soon, and I will no doubt add that to the agenda.
Paula Sheriff.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mass murder of innocents praying at their place of worship is one of the most abhorrent acts imaginable, and we must urgently have conversations about the implications of words and actions, including those in the media. My constituents, those of faith and none, are fearful of attacks. And I wonder if the Minister would comment on whether he is of the opinion that the police have adequate resources to protect our mosques, other faith establishments and other sensitive sites, and whether additional funding will be made available to these places of worship so worshippers there do feel safe.
Minister.
The Honourable Lady will know, and I met with her recently, across the House a number of colleagues are feeling intimidated and bullied and threatened on a regular basis in our inboxes and in our letters as well, and often in physical person at people's surgeries, and that is something we have to deal with. What came across, Mr. Speaker, at a meeting we recently held was, first of all, there's not enough consistency in the police response, and police leaders are aware of that. Some colleagues in this House have a good police response. Others have a wholly inadequate police response. And that goes and extends to the places of worship where people are and sometimes feel that when they need help, they don't get it. So we have to improve the consistency. We also have to improve the Crown Prosecution Services when it comes to charging people and dealing with people who are spreading hate and intimidating people. Again, it is all too random across the country, which does not provide the reassurance that many members and our constituents need.
Tracy Brabin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I, like many across the House, spent time in mosques and with my community on Friday, and obviously, as you can imagine, this was a painful reminder of what happened in Batley and Spen only 3 years ago. At times like this, obviously compassion is needed, but we need a strategy that works. Dressed up as free speech, white nationalism is a threat to us all. So would the Minister agree we need to demand more of our mainstream media, the newspaper editors who thought it was fine to screen the Facebook live film, the media barons and politicians who see difference as the enemy? We need more than thoughts and prayers when tackling hatred. We need action. So what discussions is the Minister about to have with media moguls and newspaper editors?
Minister.
Well, first of all, the strategy for dealing with terrorism is contest strategy. And the Honourable Lady, if she reads it, will realise it is a polished strategy started under the last Labour government, and it is managing to have a successful counter-terrorism effect in the United Kingdom, making it successful. When it comes to the media, whether mainstream or fringe, it is absolutely the case that they must not prioritise sensationalism over the facts, first of all. Secondly, I would say all media have a responsibility to report accurate facts. The interpretation of those facts is obviously up to the free press and the media. But we must be careful, and they must be responsible about what they do. Like her, I have frustration that some media outlets sometimes actually end up being the biggest broadcaster of hate and terrorist content, and they must be made to realise that. I'm going to be telling them that over the next few weeks, right to the top. I'm not sure my rank gets me to a mogul, but it certainly gets me to an editor.
Streeting.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I again thank the Security Minister for what he said following the appalling attacks in New Zealand, and what he said again today following the events in this country and the Netherlands over the weekend. But further to the answers he's given to other honourable and right honourable members, can I just say to him, in terms that I think my Muslim constituents would want me to, that the kind of prejudice that slaughtered innocent people in Christchurch doesn't begin with a gunman mowing down people in their place of worship. It begins with unchecked prejudice in our workplaces, in our schools, in our communities, that's amplified by the pages of national mainstream media outlets that should know better. And I'm afraid it is also legitimised by people who purport to be mainstream politicians who aspire to the highest office, who describe Muslim women as bank robbers and pillar boxes without any reaction. Can I say to him on the day that Hope Not Hate have called for action from the Conservative Party to tackle Islamophobia within their ranks, on the day that Saida Varsi, Baroness Varsi, has again asked her own party to act, on a day when I think my constituents are looking to the government to act. They will have no confidence in this government to tackle the prejudice they face unless they have confidence in the governing party to tackle racism within its own ranks. I say that with humility, but great sincerity. I'm afraid enough is enough. Condemnation in general is nothing compared to condemnation in specific. When is he and his front bench going to tackle, whether in this House or in their grassroots, the racists in their ranks?
Minister. The honourable member is right. You need to take leadership. If you see racism in your ranks, you should deal with it. If you see Islamophobia in your ranks, you should deal with it. And if I find it in my association, then they should not be in the Tory party. And if you find anti-Semitism or Islamophobia in your party, and if you have, as you, what I would say, Mr. Speaker, I totally agree with everything he has said, that we have to caution what we say and what we inspire in the privileged places that we live as leaders, political leaders in this society, and that goes for my friends, my colleagues, and my opponents on the opposition benches. But we should also recognise we should also recognise that the next step in intolerance is linking violence to politics. And the honourable member sits in a party whose shadow chancellor talked about lynching my honourable friend, the member for Ellesmere Port South at the time when she was in pensions. He sits in a party whose shadow chancellor regularly supported Irish nationalism that had a violent streak rather than a peaceful streak. So let's see what his actions are when it comes to condemning that front bench.
Al Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I associated my party with the condemnation across the House of the appalling attack in New Zealand. That attack shows, if evidence was needed, that such attacks can happen in the most peaceable and unlikely of communities. In Wales, security is a reserved matter, though the Welsh Government has responsibility for economic, social and cultural matters to do with the faith community. Is the Minister confident that there is sufficient depth of cooperation between the Home Office and the Welsh Government to ensure that such attacks do not occur in rural and indeed in city communities in Wales?
The honourable member, all I can say is we have very strong links with both the Welsh Government and indeed the police and counter-terrorism in Wales. I have been to visit a number of the sites and indeed regularly do speak, either when it's coming to exercises across the United Kingdom so we can practice our response, or indeed regularly see bulletins from what's going on in Cardiff and other parts of Wales. I am confident that the Welsh police do an outstanding job in dealing with it. Many members in this House bring examples to me about some of the far-right examples that they have brought, and I'm confident they're doing a very, very good job, and I will continue to work with the Welsh Government to make sure it's delivered.
Sir Mark Hendrick.
Security Minister, if he will do all in his powers to assure communities in Lancashire of the Islamic faith, or for that of any other faith or no faith, that everything is being done through the security and intelligence services and the police to monitor and deter any potential attackers from targeting places of worship, including online activity and political campaigns aimed at Muslims and any other minority faiths or people. Can I say to the Minister that this shouldn't just be about tolerance, which means accepting whether somebody likes it or not, but about mutual respect. Let's talk more about mutual respect, not just tolerating something because we might not like it.
How we respond to that tolerance is about mutual respect. Whether we disagree and disagree in a manner that accepts people as equals, or whether we disagree and denigrate them for having a different view, is about respect. Him and I are neighbours, Mr. Speaker, in Lancashire. We both represent a multicultural society that has worked very well together, and I am determined to make sure that we work with Lancashire Constabulary to deliver that, but also know that it's Preston Council that's going to help deliver some of those solutions as well, and indeed him and I as civic leaders.
Mary Cray.
Mr. Speaker, people in Wakefield stand in solidarity together with our Muslim community and with the people of Christchurch and the victims here at home and in Utrecht today. But can I say to the Minister that I think that the grief felt by the relatives of those killed and seriously injured will have been immeasurably increased by the knowledge that those deaths and injuries were live streamed and broadcast around the world. Does he agree with me that the days of the tech companies marking their own homework should be over, that we should be legislating in this country and in the EU to make sure that nobody profits from this type of streaming, and that any media company in this country that profited by seeing their ad revenues go up through hosting those videos on their sites should donate the increased profits and revenues to a fund for the victims and their families?
I completely agree with what the Honourable Lady said on all her points, and yes, they should donate if they made any profit off that horrendous streaming.
Debbie Abrahams.
I'd also like to express my solidarity with the New Zealand people and our Muslim brothers and sisters. And although I am pleased with what the Minister has said about regulation for social media platforms, can I just gently remind him it is 7 years after Leveson 2 was meant to have addressed that, which was completely ignored by this government.
But on the issue of prevention, I appreciated again the review on the Prevent programme. But what specifically is the government going to do on socio-economic inequalities, which are a known driver to developing distrust and alienation between different communities?
Minister.
Well, first of all, a good economy is certainly one of the ways we can try and make sure people feel more empowered. And while we will differ about how we go about that on both sides of the House, employment is a very good start point. When you mix with people in your workplace and you engage, you learn about people's differences and hopefully you come stronger together. The government has also funded with £63 million through the Community Secretary the Building Stronger in Britain Fund, which works with 230 community groups up and down the country to make sure that we work together better, integrate better and understand each other better.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last Friday, the Mayor of London and I attended the East London Mosque for a vigil in solidarity with the victims of the terror attack in New Zealand. As we left, an anti-Muslim hate crime attack took place in my constituency. Despite what happened, can I ask the Minister to look at how we take far-right activism and far-right groups and the threat more seriously? For years we have campaigned for some of those groups to be proscribed and the government has fallen short. I asked him to take that much more seriously, to look at making online platforms responsible for the content of what they provide, and also to consider the German approach of fining online companies when hate material, online hate propaganda is on those sites, because without making them responsible and making them pay for what they host, we are not going to be able to tackle this appalling level of hatred against Muslims but also other minorities.
Well, the Honourable Lady, I don't in any way, nor do the police and intelligence services I work with, in any way miss or fail to recognise the threat from the far right. We do not treat them. It was this government that first prescribed a far-right neo-Nazi group, National Action, over 18 months ago. We did that, and we have taken some subsequent action against a number of those people and organisers. However, on hate crime, which is also part of the planks we need to take away from extremists, we have funded a £1.5 million action plan, and we've asked the Law Commission to review the hate crime legislation to make sure it is fit for purpose. And no doubt that Law Commission will look at the online space about hate crime as well, and hopefully it can feed in to the online white paper that's coming soon.
Hannah Bardell.
Much, Mr. Speaker, we stand in solidarity with the Muslim community in Christchurch in New Zealand and across the world. As someone whose family emigrated there, my mother emigrated in the 50s with my grandparents, and only by virtue of lack of employment am I a Scot and not a Kiwi.
Better luck next time.
Yeah, but the attacks in Christchurch are surely a tipping point for social media companies and for this government to act. And I take on board what he says about collaboration and cooperation, but the government have been dragging their heels on the white paper, and I understand he needs to collaborate with countries across the world, but surely now is the time to show some leadership, step forward, have proper legislation and regulation, because not only should no family lose a loved one in such horrific circumstances, they should not have to then find out that the brutal murder of their loved one was streamed online for 17 minutes and is still going around online now.
Well, look, I hope the Honourable Lady, when the white paper comes out, will not be disappointed. It is absolutely the case, the way the internet is constructed, we have to make sure that it works. There's simply no point putting out a whole lot of regulation if everyone puts their servers in somewhere like Cuba or North Korea and nothing can change. We have to make sure we have a technical solution alongside a regulatory solution.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I
thank my colleague from Lewisham East for securing this urgent question and for you for granting it. Can I also say how disappointed I am at the whataboutery response to the question from the member from Ilford North? Let me tell the Minister, as a Muslim who has the largest Muslim constituency in the United Kingdom, and have been spent the weekend reassuring not only the constituents but my own Muslim family, I can tell you how Islamophobia happens. It happens because it goes unchecked. It happens because people in politics have responsibilities that they do not meet. And in this instance, let me also say, Mr. Speaker, this party ran the most Islamophobic dog whistle campaign against the Mayor of London, who happens to be Muslim. This party is yet to apologise for that Islamophobic campaign. Its former chair, Baroness Varsi, is crying out for an inquiry, as is its Conservative Muslim Forum. When will you check your own house in order before he can give me any confidence or my constituents that this party can safeguard the Muslim community?
Well, I'm a good long friend of Baroness Varsi, and I read both her book and I met with her, and indeed I tried to encourage her to apply to be the Extremism Commissioner at the time that the post was advertised, because I thought she would bring a good measure of sense to dealing with some of those issues. Regretfully, she didn't take up my invitation, but it would have been a good thing. Look, I'm not making an excuse for Islamophobia. Islamophobia exists. Islamophobia is racism. Islamophobia should be dealt with. If it happens in my party, we should deal with it, and we should deal with it forthwith. And I will be absolutely happy, wherever I see it, to do it. What we should all do is make sure we deal with it. And I totally agree with her. It is racism, and we should stop it where we see it in its tracks.
Yasmin Qureshi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The old expression, the pen is mightier than the sword. Words written and spoken have consequences. And over the last 20 years, we have seen the rise of anti-migrant sentiments, anti-Muslim sentiments, anti-BME community sentiments, not only in the United Kingdom, not only in Europe, not only in America, also in Australia, where politicians, media, online as well as print and others, newspaper moguls, editors like Fox News owners, Murdoch, the Daily Express, The Sun and others have consistently run lies and lies about all of these communities. It is not surprising then that some people, hearing this day in, day out, actually start hating those communities. And then when we have established writers and columnists in this country like Katie Hopkins and Rod Liddell and Melanie Phillips and others encouraging all this. So my question is, when are we going to seriously tackle the question of what's written in the media?
I still believe the best way to challenge the ignorance and the misinformation spread by the likes of Katie Hopkins is to call them out and challenge their argument. The best way to bring some of these people down and show them to be the Walter Mitties or the fake people they are is to put their arguments to the test, and it fails time and time again. Do you know, when I read the online advice published by people like Al-Qaeda, it's by made-up, half-trained imams who don't know what they're talking about Islam. When I see the neo-Nazi, the National Action stuff, it's written by pretty much imbeciles making 2 + 2 = 10. The best way to expose them to our young people is when you challenge that in a forum, they fall over at the first test. That is a good way to put them out of business for good.
May I very gently say to the Minister and to colleagues that as we have now been on this matter for 1 hour and 2 minutes, there is a premium upon brevity. On this, the occasion of the 574th urgent question during my time in the chair. I never like to cut these off. I want to facilitate colleagues, but it would be helpful if we could have questions and pithy answers rather than orations. Annalisa Dodds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My city of Oxford saw some truly disgusting Islamophobic graffiti sprayed last weekend. Local police are dealing resolutely with this, but we all know that's on top of enormous pressures in my city's case from knife crime and from county lines as well. We've had senior police officers saying they don't have sufficient resources. The Minister's right, it's not just about policing resources, but surely this is part of it. And is he going to be asking for more?
Minister. Last year, when the Police Intelligence Services came to ask for more, we gave them £161 million more, and we made sure that we found the funding year on year as the threat increased.
Khalid Mahmood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I pay my condolences to the families of the deceased and the injured in New Zealand and Netherlands, and also praise the actions of the New Zealand Prime Minister? Will he look at the internet companies and social media companies and on the face of the bill and hold them responsible for that? And will he also ask his right honourable friend, who is not in the chamber at the moment, to whether he'll meet with me and imams from across the country to look at how we can protect our places of worship?
I'm on the last request. Absolutely, I will make sure that the Home Secretary replies to that request. I am very happy to also meet him on a regular basis with his communities if he wants to discuss what more can be done, so we can keep an eye on it.
Imran Hussain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I join honourable members across the House in condemning these horrific, sickening, cowardly terrorist attacks? But also, can we as a House unite today and pay tribute to all those, the heartening response that we saw demonstrated by people of faith and no faith, up and down, not just in our country, but broader, that stood in solidarity and made it clear that those that seek to divide us will never, ever succeed. And this House today wants to be very clear in that message. Mr. Speaker, tragically, the point has been made, but I do believe we need to re-emphasise this. We are seeing far-right and Islamophobic views are being tolerated and normalised by those in the mainstream more and more. Those in power and responsibility, whether that's in the media, public life or public institutions. Now, frankly, that is feeding into the rise of the far right and also the Islamophobia. Can the Minister tell me what concrete steps he will take to address this, to end all forms of racism and all, in particular, Islamophobia?
Thank you. Minister.
When I see Islamophobia in the media, it breaks down into three ways. Laziness, because people couldn't be bothered, or journalists, to find out about what they're writing about. Ignorance, because they don't know anything about the religion or the people or the communities they write about. Or naked racism or aggression towards it. Those three factors, two of which I think we can deal with quite well. We need to make sure that we educate people about different faiths in this country and understand the differences within the faiths and the differences across the faiths. We need to bring more people together to understand our different communities, and that's why the £63 million of Building Strong Community is a good place to start. If we can do that, we can remove the ignorance and we can teach tolerance and respect of each other, then I think together we will make a difference, and it's a strong message to send.
Mohamed Yassin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's very clear that this government is not doing enough to tackle this crime, because Home Office reported very recently that religious hate crime rocketed by 40% across England and Wales in just 1 year. More than half of these targeted at Muslims. What is his government going to do now to tackle the rise in the far-right attacks against British Muslims and other minority communities?
And as I said to one of his honourable colleagues, first of all, we asked the Law Commission to review hate crime to make sure it is a legislation fit for the 21st century to deal with such things as online, etc., and how that has changed. And we're going to fund that with £1.5 million. We're also going to make sure that we tackle that ignorance that I talked about in the communities. I think that's the first thing we need to do. And at the same time, online harm, to make sure people stop spreading it. And we've also funded groups like work with groups like Tell Mama, so people can report it better, because by reporting it and getting better data, we'll be able to do something about it.
Bring the treaty with me.
Catherine McKinnell.
Mr. Speaker, can I implore the Minister to resist the temptation, as a government minister, to get into a he said, she said, party political defence in any way of racism at any level in our society? And does he agree with me that as political parties who lead the country and aspire to lead the country, that we are all responsible for promoting tolerance, equality and being against racism in all of its forms, wherever it may appear, and as membership organisations, we have a responsibility to ensure that zero tolerance within our ranks means exactly that.
Yeah. Totally agree.
Jim McMahon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Muslim community in Oldham are deeply concerned about the prospect of being targeted in further attacks. I see the type of lower-level abuse that I see online, and it's that drip that creates a culture where people think you can go further, you can push it, and difference is okay, and it should be divided on even further. But the fund that the government have in place to protect places of worship, the application deadline for that closed in August last year. We know there's an underspend in that budget. There is no reason why they can't have a rolling fund in place, so applicants don't have to wait until the government are able to administer that application process. So please take off the brake from that fund and give places of worship the protection that they need.
Hear, hear.
Minister.
The honourable member has great foresight. Watch this space.
Catherine West.
Speaker, and could I put on record my association with the comments from the member for Mole Valley, who is an Antipodean as well. And could I also thank you for going to Finsbury Park Mosque, which is one of my local mosques. But also, could I challenge the Minister to discuss with the DFE how we can have our schools, particularly in areas which are predominantly non-Muslim, so that they can visit mosques, synagogues, Hindu temples, churches, in these times when people don't necessarily get taught any religion at home, so that we can promote awareness across the piece, not just in our areas where we have a lot of Muslim constituents, but across all of our communities, so that this can't just pop up in a spirit of ignorance.
The honourable lady is right. It starts often in ignorance and is then exploited. I think it's different in different constituencies. In my constituency, people do go and visit different communities and mosques and places like that, and I would definitely urge other people to do it. But I'm very happy to write to the Department of Education to make sure that we redouble the efforts and spread the good practice across the country.
Dr. Lisa Cameron.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. My thoughts are with all of those affected. Extremism is on the rise on the left and the right, but much of this is being harnessed in our prisons, where hardened extremists are housed alongside young offenders who may be impressionable but extremely risky. So what dialogue is he having across departments to justice to ensure that the policy reaches right across these departments and that our prisons counter radicalisation and our places of rehabilitation?
Hear, hear.
In the last 2 years, we've done some work with the Ministry of Justice to either seek, where appropriate, the occasion segregation away from vulnerable people. We've also redoubled our efforts into taking the PREVENT programme into prisons and added a bit of compulsion around some offenders in the area of going into the Channel programme to make sure that they are challenged and hopefully diverted from that course, because we, like the honourable lady, totally recognise that that is a captive audience, effectively.